My job, I think, is to help our thinning audience realize you made the right decision not to go wherever everyone else is, at the airport, in downtown San Francisco, Napa Valley, I'm not sure. Um, so what I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes with you is sharing some lessons that I've learned from the experience of implementing a new process excellence program at Bridgewater over the past 3 years and at Parsons Brinckerhoff for a few years before that. And what I mean by the BPM chasm is the crossing that one makes from a lower maturity model or lower maturity level to a higher maturity level. So for both of these cases, the BPM programs are very new. They hadn't existed before. People can't spell BPM in the company. And so my role was to build something from a very low level of capability into one that's sustainable and stable. And so if you're familiar with CMMI's 5-level maturity model, starts at level 1, where things are chaotic and undefined, goes to level 2, where they become repeatable, where you can use lessons learned in the past, then moving to level 3, where things become standardized and stable, to successive levels of being measured, level 4, and predictably continually improved or optimized at level 5. The chasm that I've seen, it comes from a guy named Paul Harmon, who edits a website called BP Trends. And what Harmon has said is that that gap from level 2 to level 3 is the one that most organizations have the trouble crossing. And so that is the context of this presentation. I'm starting off here with a picture of a bridge. Since we're talking about crossing chasms, we need to build bridges to do that. This is the Brooklyn Bridge, which was first built in the years 1870 to 1883. This engineer by the name of John Augustus Roebling had this idea that it would be neat to connect Long Island with the island of Manhattan. And so this structure was like nothing that had ever been built at the time. People didn't believe that it was possible. There was a lot of doubts and naysaying, but he finally was able to persevere and get approval for the project. As the construction began, shortly after, there was a tragic accident and he died. And so for most of the years of construction, his son took over and became the new chief engineer. However, he was in an accident and he was paralyzed. He couldn't talk or speak. So he supervised the construction from his apartment that maybe had a view of the bridge like what we're looking at now by tapping signals with his finger on his wife's arm. That was the only part that he could move. His wife became, without any mathematics or engineering training, the de facto chief engineer for building this, wonder of the modern world. Eventually, the bridge was built on its first day, was crossed by tens and tens of thousands of people. They had a parade of 40 elephants to show that the bridge would stand and be stable. And the story shows the importance of qualities that would be useful to you for business transformation. Determination, independent thinking, creativity. By summoning those qualities, they were able to build a bridge that hadn't been built before. I'm going to talk about a few themes of how we can do this also in our organizations. And the first one, which has been spoken about often and on the panel that I sat on yesterday, organizational culture. I think this is a critical factor that has to be addressed when planning and developing and delivering a business transformation. Before I go into some specifics about the cultures that I experienced at Parsons Brinckerhoff, Bridgewater, and how we adapted our approach, I just want to make sure we have a common understanding of what we mean by culture. And so I'm going to tell you a story of a scientific experiment involving a cage with a bunch of gorillas. So the gorillas are put into this cage, and in the middle of the cage, there's a platform with some bananas hanging down from it. One of the gorillas goes up to the platform to get to the bananas. As soon as he does, icy cold water falls down from the ceiling on every other gorilla in the cage. So they pull him down and they beat him up. And so after a while, they're looking at the bananas and they're like, well, let's try this again. Every time the same thing happens. Water pours on every other gorilla. They beat up the guy that's trying to go for the bananas. Eventually, they learn, don't go for the bananas. Then a new gorilla is introduced into the population. One of the original gorillas is removed. When the new gorilla gets there, he looks at the gorillas, he looks at the bananas, and he's thinking, we're gorillas. Don't we like bananas? What's going on with this? And so he starts walking towards the platform. He doesn't even get to touch it. No icy water comes down. As soon as he makes that move towards the platform, the other gorillas jump on him and beat him up. And so this process continues with the scientist, who must have had a little bit of sadism in him, I suppose, pulling gorillas on the original population out, introducing new gorillas into the population. Eventually, no gorillas eating the bananas, no gorillas ever experienced the cold water falling down, but the norm has become part of this social construct of the gorillas. The relevance of this, as we think about organizational culture, is that there are norms and behaviors that are reinforced and accepted as assumed truths, even if they may no longer have functional utility. They were probably functional at some point, leading to that reinforcement, and now people do them without knowing any reason why. The next thing I want to do is show a clip. It's about 15 seconds from a video, and it's just a comedy, but it's this police officer is going undercover as a baseball umpire. And I think this shows just how the world stops before he makes that decision. He doesn't realize what the umpire is supposed to do. He's never done it before. He's just kind of watching the pitch. But there's actually no pitch. It's just two guys playing catch. There's a story about three umpires talking about how they make decisions to call balls and strikes. And the first umpire says, well, listen, I just call them the way they are. He doesn't admit any possibility of error. He says he's going to call it exactly right every time. The second umpire says, well, no. I call him like I see him. He at least understands that he has limits of the abilities of his perception. So he says, oh, I don't necessarily call them the way they are. I just call them the way I see them. The third umpire says, both of you guys are wrong. They're not anything until I call them. The third umpire, which like the story or like the video clip, knows that until he says ball or strike, there is no ball or strike. It's not that he's calling it like it is. It's not even like he's calling it like he's seeing it. His action, just like in the video, when he says strike, then it becomes a strike. That is culture. Organizational culture has significance that is socially constructed, not an independent reality. Realizing this context, I think, is very important and helpful to navigating organizational culture. It's not always as real as it seems. And then the third story, and I'm going to ask for help from people in the audience. If you're imagining you're this fish that I've circled here with the red circle, you're swimming through here and you're making a list of everything you see. What do you think would be at the bottom of the fish's list? The last thing in that exhaustive list of everything he sees. Does anybody have any idea? Water. Thank you. The answer is the water. He swims through, he sees the other fish, he sees these plants and corals, and he may see stuff outside, the distorted images of the room that the aquarium's in. But the last thing he notices, because it's ubiquitous and transparent and it's assumed part of his existence, is the water. He swims through the water, relying on it, experiencing it constantly and never noticing it. This is the last thing to realize about culture. If you want to understand more about culture, I would recommend a book by a guy named Edgar Schein, who is a professor at MIT, I think at the Sloan School of Business there. He came up with the term organizational culture in, I think it was 1990. He wrote an article, then he expanded it into a book. He talks about assumptions. That is really the root of culture. What are the assumptions that people are making that underlie their values, which underlie their behaviors in the visible artifacts? That's where we can understand culture. And so how does this apply to a BPM program? So I alluded to it a little bit on the panel, but I wanted to save some to reward people that would spend the last afternoon of the conference with me. So I'll give you more today. So I gave you some examples about the successive introduction of metrics. In some organizations, shining the light of truth in parts of the organization, which is very important for making evidence-based decisions for improving processes, may be a cultural evolution and a change. And so in some organizations, this has to be done successively and incrementally. In our organization at Bridgewater, this is not so much the challenge, but there are other challenges that have to be kept in mind. So our organization is an intellectual services company that is not very execution-oriented, not very operationally oriented. It's one where the owner of the company had said, you know what, the way that, and our company is an investment management company, so the way that he's made money over time is he's thought very independently, he's questioned assumptions, and he's made investment decisions. So he's created this culture and he's hired people deliberately that will think independently, not accept authority, that will question everything that you're doing. If you're trying to run an enterprise-wide transformation, that could be an extremely disruptive culture because anyone, anywhere can derail it versus at least in more hierarchical organizations, a few key stakeholders can derail it. So the way that we launched this program is we started with business architecture, creating a framework and a structure. And the way that we syndicated the business architecture is we went to each business unit and got a representative, brought them in, and we engaged with these 15 representatives in this kind of spoke and wheel model, where we went to one, came back to the middle, went to the other one, came back, went to the other one, came back, and kept evolving this and educating people on the need, the business case for why we were even doing it, because we believe that building the architecture is an important first step. And I saw in if any of you were here on Monday for the earlier session, the Wilson Perumal presentation had an example of building a house. And so they showed two graphics. One, they built like the corner of the house and had all the painting and shingles and everything, and then they built like the other part, and then they built, no one builds a house that way, with the point. The other one is you have a skeleton, then you build the walls, then you paint it, and you do it that way. So you start with the overall enterprise-wide framework, which is a business architecture. So we went to the 15 people, we did this spoke and wheel model. Then we went to about 30 top-level people that weren't necessarily vested as authority of these business units, but technologists, HR leaders, chiefs of staff to the C-level. There's people that have been there for 15 years, which in our company, there's only a handful of people that have been there so long. The owner founded it with his roommate 40 years ago, and it's grown since then. So now we have a little bit over 2,000 people, many of whom have been hired just in the past few years. So we went to all of these people, then we went to the department head, then we went to the management committee individually to all of these people, and then finally when the CEO presented the business architecture to the company's owner, no random person was objecting to it, which is a very unusual meeting in our company. And the owner didn't say anything. And so me and my guy, the business architect, we walked out of that meeting. We were like, wow, that was anticlimactic and kind of disappointing. One of the consultants that had been working with us on this for the past couple of years now, but at the time for the past year, he says, listen, you guys have it all wrong. If he didn't like it, you would have heard something. So I thought that's true. So you have to understand the culture that you're operating in and adapt your process to that. Our culture is one of deliberation, of independent thinking, and so that process of getting alignment, documenting the meetings, sending out written polls, ways of doing this so that we didn't have some kind of derailing objections late in the process. Next thing I want to talk about is maturity level. And so in some ways, this whole presentation is about building a bridge from a lower maturity level to a higher maturity level. But it's also understanding where are you starting from and then adapting appropriately. So I'm going to show you some personal photos. This is my oldest daughter. She's 15 years old. Being a parent or a father to a 15-year-old teenager, first of all, is supposed to evoke sympathy on your part for me. And second of all, I am not as young as I look, but that's healthy living. And then third of all, the parenting lesson is that it's more of like being a coach or a mentor to somebody that's 15 years old than to her younger sister. This one's in middle school, that's kind of in that bridge from the elementary school to the high school. You have to have more structure, more limits, and it's not so much reasoning, it's more authoritarian. And then we've got a bit of an age gap till we get to my third and last one, who just learned to walk not too long ago, and so she needs a gate across the staircase or she'll fall down the stairs. And so three very different parenting styles for three children at different ages of maturity levels. And so for the company I'm at now, because it's never done BPM, it doesn't have any business units that have done BPM, it's not very process or execution oriented. Is there something with do you hear the feedback? What is it? This thing is causing me problems every day of this conference. It's on silent, but it's still making noise. Maturity level. So the maturity level of organizations depends on, or dictates how you would approach your transformation effort. So our organization is more like this level. At Parsons Brinckerhoff, it was an engineering company. It was about building bridges, building highways. That was the business that they were in. So different business units had very mature quality functions, process management functions, and so that could be leveraged in a different way. When I go outside at conferences like this and see different vendors, they're offering different products and different services that could be more or less relevant for you depending what maturity level you're at. The most advanced BPM software would be like giving the baby a car, but the 15-year-old probably in the next year or so is going to need a car. So you have to adapt how you're designing your program based on where are you right now and assess that accurately. The next thing I want to talk about is results. And I'm going to give a few examples here and then also tie this in to the BPM program. So the first one, this image is Thomas Jefferson's tombstone. And so Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States. He was the Secretary of State. But it doesn't list any of those things on the tombstone. It says, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. So it says the things that he gave rather than the positions that he got. Another leader, very similarly, Martin Luther King Jr. This is an image from his speech in 1963, shaped the way the country was heading in a very powerful way, although he held no official office. Another American president, Lincoln, in the Civil War, there's a story of how he had to go to his general rather than the other way around. And one time he goes to the general's house, and the servant comes down and says, "Oh, Mr. President, I'm sorry, the general's gone to sleep," with the president waiting for him. And so Lincoln said, okay, I'll come back tomorrow. And people were surprised. Why would you let the general treat you like this? And he says, well, if the general will win battles for me, I'll hold his horse for him. That kind of humble servant leadership, I think, is important, being focused on the goals, not on status and appearances. And then last one, to use a non-American example, here's Buddha, an iconic image. If we think about, like, in the time that he was living, how many emperors and kings built monuments and tombstones and all of these things that would help us remember them through the ages. This image, though, everyone knows who Buddha is. He's one of the founders of the world's religions. It's an iconic type of image that people recognize, but few of us would know who was the emperor of India when Buddha taught there. So thinking about, like, what are you delivering for the business rather than the recognitions and trappings and so forth, I think is very important. My executive sponsor, who has actually since left the company, but he brought me in to found this program a few years ago, was a guy named Kevin Campbell, who was the formerly managing director of business process outsourcing at Accenture. So he was a big believer in business process. And when he was asked to come into Bridgewater as the COO, he realized that process is part of the solution. And so Kevin's guidance to me, as we were building out this business architecture and this enterprise-wide framework, was to also go deep in a few particular areas so that we would be generating that business results, which would become word of mouth and create support for others, to make sure that we, from others, to make sure that we were delivering something that would be recognized as valuable for the business. So the importance of results and momentum, I think, is something to consider. And then the fourth and last theme that I want to talk about are champions. So many people, I think, probably know this guy. The Game of Thrones has great marketing, so his image is all over there, and maybe people watch the show or have read the books. What does this have to do with business transformation and BPM? I won't make the audience guess at the answer to that. If you look at, what's happened in this story with this character, Tyrion, he's constantly getting into trouble that's resolved by trial by combat. Now, trial by combat, business transformation, there's some similarities there, but the one that I'm bringing up is that each time he finds somebody that's going to be a champion for him to defend him in these trial by combat so he doesn't have to do it himself. And so executive championship is the key towards sustainment and success of a transformation program. Your ability to cultivate an executive champion or champions in your organization is a critical success factor to the program. And so that was something else that I want to reflect on. Those people will acquire resources, intervene with difficult stakeholders, evangelize the program, and protect the program in difficult times. So championship is extremely important. So it goes back now to the story of the bridge. Independent thinking, creativity, determination, those kinds of personal qualities in your program director are very important, just like they were for this guy building another type of bridge. But if for you trying to build bridges from a lower level of capability and process excellence to a higher level capability, I think those qualities are important, as well as understanding of the themes that I had talked about: culture, maturity level, winning early results, and executive sponsorship. That's the presentation, the lessons I've learned from the journey at Bridgewater, and if we have time, I have time for questions. Yes, ma'am.
Where are you on your maturity journey now?
So, a couple contexts for that. So first of all, in the company, and I'm sure it's the same in your company or other companies, the people that don't come to PEX conferences and BPM conferences don't care. So keep that context in mind. I would use this, though, to track our progress and more of an internal metric for myself. I would use like the Gartner BPM assessment, which also is a 1 to 5 kind of thing. I would put us at level 3 because we've achieved control systems that are sustainable and are enterprise-wide and have standardized treating process information as a single source of truth and system of record. I was talking about data integrity a bit yesterday. But I would caveat that there's still a way of getting the entire organization up to that same level. It's not a consistent level 3 across the organization. We're probably about 2/3 of the way there. But that's an encouraging point to cross where most of the organization is now using this same type of process management platform. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.